In the wings of a stone theater, a Roman actor stands in lamplight, holding the mask in both hands before his face. He has done this many times. The weight of it is familiar, hollow at the mouth, exaggerated at the brow, carved to be read from the uppermost tier of a full amphitheater. He holds it at the distance of an arm's length and studies it, the way one studies a face that is not quite one's own. In a few moments he will lift it, and his breathing will change, and his voice, passing through the carved aperture of its mouth, will become something larger than the man who generates it, audible across stone and open sky, legible to strangers seated in the highest rows. He knows this. He has known it for years. What he pauses to feel, each time, in the moment before the mask rises, is the interval between what he is and what he is about to become. That interval is very old. It is older than the theater. It is older, perhaps, than philosophy itself. The word that would eventually name the mask, and the self behind it, and the confusion between the two, arrived in Latin through a path that scholars have traced carefully, though not without some difficulty. The Latin asterisk persona, asterisk most likely descended from an Etruscan source. The figure called asterisk fersu, asterisk, a masked ritual character associated not with civic entertainment, but with something older and stranger, connected to the ceremonies of the dead. In Etruscan tomb paintings, this figure appears in the dim company of underworld rites, wearing a covering that is not merely costume, but transformation, a boundary between the world of the living and the world beneath it. The mask, in its earliest surviving usage, was not theatrical decoration. It was a device for crossing from one kind of existence into another. It was a threshold worn on the face. When the Romans adopted the word and adjusted its meaning toward the theater, they kept, without quite knowing it, something of that older strangeness. A stasterisk persona, asterisk was still a covering that changed what passed through it. The actor behind the mask was still, in some sense, absent. What the audience received was the role, the voice amplified and shaped by the hollow mouth, the expression fixed and readable at distance, the character made legible by the very removal of the particular human face beneath it. The mask did not add meaning, it concentrated it. And in concentrating it, it raised a question the Romans did not fully settle, and which has not been settled since. If the mask speaks clearly, and the face beneath it speaks in a murmur, which of the two is telling the truth? These were practical questions for a working actor. They became philosophical ones for everyone else. In Greece, before Rome had developed its own theatrical tradition, the problem of the mask was already inscribed into the structure of the drama itself. The Greek theatrical mask, the asterisk prosopon asterisk, meaning literally that which faces forward, or that which is held toward, served the same amplifying function as its later Roman counterpart. In the open-air amphitheaters of Athens, carved from hillsides and filling with citizens on festival days, the distance between performer and audience made the unmasked human face essentially unreadable. The mask solved a problem of scale. It made the character visible where the person would have been invisible. But in solving that problem, it introduced another. The culture that attended these performances was already engaged, through its philosophy, its religion, and its law, with a distinction that the mask made physically present, the distinction between the role one performs within a social order and the nature one carries beneath every performance. This distinction did not require philosophy to feel its weight. Every Athenian citizen who watched a tragedy from those stone seats had already lived inside it. The city assigned its roles with force, citizen or slave, man or woman, Athenian or barbarian, honored or dishonored. These roles were not chosen. They arrived through birth and circumstance, and they shaped the entire visible surface of a life. What the tragedies asked in their long afternoon performances was what happened when the role and the nature beneath it came apart. What happened when the mask, through catastrophe or revelation, stopped fitting? No story held that question with more force than the story of Oedipus. Sophocles wrote his account of Oedipus's catastrophe sometime around 429 BCE, and it has not grown less difficult in the centuries since. Oedipus stands at the opening of the play, at the height of his social role. He is king of Thebes. He is the man who solved the riddle of the Sphinx when no one else could. He is the savior of the city, publicly and ceremonially, and he wears that role with the full weight of civic authority. He stands at the city gate and addresses his people from within the mask of competence and sovereign care. He will investigate the source of the plague. He will find the answer. He will protect his city as he has always protected it, through the application of intelligence to disorder. What the investigation reveals, slowly and with a horrible precision, is that the man wearing the mask of savior is the source of the very pollution he is trying to remove. The king and the killer are the same person. The solver of riddles is himself the unsolved riddle. And when the last layer of the mask is stripped away by the weight of evidence he himself has assembled, what remains is not simply a man in disgrace. What remains is the question of who Oedipus was before the mask arrived, before the role of king was assigned to him, before the civic theater of Thebes constructed a performance around his particular capacities, before the identity and the person became inseparable enough that their separation required catastrophe. The Athenians watched this story in the open air, wearing their ordinary faces, watching an actor wear the mask of a man whose face turned out to be a mask for a still deeper truth he had never known. The layers were visible even from the uppermost tier. Plato was watching something similar, though his theater was different. Writing in the decades after the great tragedies were composed, he returned again and again to the problem of appearance and reality, of the performed surface and the nature beneath it. His most sustained single image for this problem is the one he sets in the seventh book of the Republic, and it has been sitting in the philosophical tradition ever since, with the patient endurance of a very good argument. The cave in Plato's allegory is deep and artificial. A group of prisoners sits chained at the bottom of it, positioned so that they cannot turn their heads. Behind them, unseen, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, figures pass carrying objects, and the firelight throws the shadows of those objects onto the wall, the prisoner's face. This is all the prisoners have ever seen. The shadows are, to them, not appearances of things, but things themselves, the entire contents of a world that is in fact a projection, a theater of illusions sustained by a light the prisoners cannot see, and figures they cannot turn to observe. One prisoner is freed. He turns toward the fire, and the pain of the unfamiliar light is immediate. He is then led up a passage toward the entrance of the cave, and the pain of daylight, when he reaches it, is worse still. He can barely see. Gradually, his eyes adjust. He begins to see reflections in water, then shadows cast by the sun, then objects in sunlight directly, then the sun itself. When he returns to the cave, as Plato requires that he must, out of obligation to those he has left behind, he can no longer see as he once did. The darkness is too thick. The prisoners, who have grown expert in reading the shadows, surpass him in that skill. They take his disorientation for ignorance. The image is carrying several arguments at once, and Plato knew it. The most direct one concerns the education of philosophers, the slow and painful training of the mind to move from appearances toward the forms, the deep structures of reality that the shadows only imperfectly represent. But the image reaches naturally toward the problem that was already visible in the theater, and in Oedipus's catastrophe, and in the Etruscan masked figure at the edge of the underworld. The prisoner's mistake projected shadows for the world. They have been doing this their whole lives, with considerable skill and social fluency. They can discuss the shadows, predict their movements, build a shared vocabulary for interpreting them. What they cannot do is know that they are shadows. That requires turning. The act of turning is what philosophy is for Plato. It is the painful reorientation of the entire self, not just the intellect, but the desires and loyalties and habits of attention towards something more real than the projected surface. And the difficulty of returning, of bringing that reorientation back into the social world where the shadows are still taken for the thing itself, is not incidental to the argument. It is the argument's sharpest point. The philosopher who is turned cannot simply live on the surface with the ease of those who have never looked behind them. The gap between the social mask, the performed self of civic life, and what that philosopher has glimpsed is a permanent condition. It does not close. Plato was writing in the shadow of Socrates' death, and the execution of his teacher for the crime of corrupting the youth of Athens was never far from his mind. Socrates had spent his life turning away from the social performances of Athenian respectability, turning toward questions that made the comfortable masks of the city uncomfortable. He had asked generals what courage was, and they had not known. He had asked politicians what justice was, and they had not known. He had asked poets what beauty was, and they had given him the products of beauty rather than its nature. The mask in every case had failed to account for itself, and the city, in the end, had chosen to prosecute the man who kept turning the masks around. The Stoics came after Plato, and they found his account of the cave useful, though they placed it inside a very different cosmological framework. For the Stoics, the world was not a cave of shadows from which the philosopher escaped. It was a rational order. The asterisk logos, asterisk, the principle of reason that structured all things, in which every human being had been assigned a role by the divine arrangement of events. The theatrical metaphor returned, but with a different valence. In Epictetus, in Marcus Aurelius, in Cicero's ethical writings, the image of the cosmic play recurs with enough regularity to suggest that it was doing genuine philosophical work for all of them. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, framed the theatrical metaphor in terms of the multiple roles every person occupies simultaneously: the role given by nature, the role given by circumstance of birth and country, the roles chosen through profession and relationship and voluntary commitment. The wise life for Cicero was not a life that escaped these roles, but one that inhabited them with clarity and skill. The question was not whether to wear the mask, but how to wear it, whether with the anxious self-promotion of the social climber, or with the steady competence of the person who understands that the role is not the self, and that this distinction, properly understood, is a form of freedom rather than a diminishment. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the 2nd century CE, returned to this framework throughout his private notebooks, the asterisk, meditations asterisk, which were never written for an audience, and which survive as perhaps the most intimate record of a Stoic mind examining itself. Marcus was emperor of Rome, which meant that the public mask he wore was among the most elaborate and demanding ever constructed. The obligations of the role were total and unrelenting. The performance of imperial authority was constant, And yet the notebooks written in Greek to himself at the end of long days of public duty return again and again to the same question. What, beneath all of this, is mine? What belongs to me in a way that the roll cannot touch? The Stoic answer to that question was always the same, and Marcus returned to it the way one returns to a necessary truth rather than a discovered one, the way one returns to something always already known, in need of reminder rather than argument. What is mine is the capacity to judge well, to desire rightly, to act from reason and integrity. The external role, emperor, general, the most powerful man in the world, belongs to the same category as health and wealth and reputation, preferred perhaps, but not owned, not the self, not the thing that constitutes the quality of a life. The Stoics called this the asterisk hegemonkon asterisk, the ruling or guiding part of the mind, and they guarded it the way one guards a lamp in wind, carefully, but without the kind of desperate attachment that would itself compromise its steadiness. It was Epictetus who expressed this most precisely, and the precision had the sharpness that comes from personal experience of its necessity. Epictetus was born into slavery, probably in the 1st century CE, in the city of Hierapolis, in what is now western Turkey. He was brought to Rome as a slave, and became the property of a man named Epaphroditus, himself a freedman who had risen to become a secretary under the Emperor Nero. In his years of enslavement, Epictetus had the most extreme possible experience of the gap between the role assigned by social circumstance and the nature of the person beneath it. His body was not his own. His labor was not his own. His time and his movement and his place in the world were determined entirely by his legal status as property. If there was anything in such a life that could be called free, it was not to be found in any of the categories that Rome used to measure freedom. What Epictetus found, and later taught, in the school he ran after receiving his freedom, in the city of Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, was a line, not a geographical line, not a legal one, a line drawn with such care and such steadiness that it amounted to something like a map of the interior. On one side of this line, everything that happens to the self from outside, the body and its conditions, health and illness, social position, the opinions of others, the circumstances of birth and death, the assigned role, the mask that society requires one to wear. All of this, Epictetus said, was asterisk, not mine asterisk, not in the sense that mattered philosophically. It was the province of fortune and circumstance and the decisions of others. It could be taken, adjusted, reassigned, stripped away. It was, in the deepest sense, external. On the other side of the line, the capacity to respond, the quality of judgment, the direction of desire, the assent given to propositions, the values chosen and maintained, the integrity of the reasoning mind, these, and only these, were genuinely one's own. A master could order the body. He could not order the assent. He could shape the circumstances of a life entirely. He could not touch the quality of the response to those circumstances. The line between what belongs to us and what does not was, for Epictetus, not a consolation offered to those who had lost everything. It was a philosophical precision, and its sharpness was the measure of the freedom it protected. He wrote this in the asterisk Enchiridion, asterisk, the handbook, the thing carried in the hand, and the opening lines of that text have the quality of something reduced to its essential form through long and honest compression. Some things are in our control, and others are not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and whatever is genuinely our own action. Not in our control are body, reputation, command, and whatever is not our own action. The list is short. The distinction is total. In the small room in Nicopolis where Epictetus taught, students came from across the Roman world, young men of good family, aspiring to philosophy, bringing their own quite different experiences of the gap between assigned role and interior life. What he told them was not what most of them expected. He was not interested in teaching them to manage their social performances more elegantly. He was interested in the line. He drew it again and again, in different words, with different examples, returning to the same precision each time, as though testing it, as though the act of drawing the line clearly was itself the philosophical work, not a preliminary to it. The role you have been given, Epictetus taught, the body you were born into, the family you belong to, the position you occupy in the civic order, the mask that your time and place require you to wear. None of this is your true identity. It is the part you are playing in the larger order of things, and the quality of your life depends not on which part you have been given, but on the honesty and integrity with which you inhabit it. This is not indifference to the world. It is a precise attention to what in the world is genuinely one's own. The Stoic theatrical metaphor carried this thought in its most concentrated form. Marcus Aurelius used it. Epictetus used it. And underneath it was the same recognition that had been visible in the stone theaters of Athens, in the masked rituals of the Etruscans, in the hollow-mouthed Roman mask held in lamplight before the performance began. The role and the self are not the same thing, and the distance between them, properly understood, is not a loss, but a kind of shelter. A chorus of masked figures moves across the orchestra floor of an open-air amphitheater. It is midday. The stone seats are full, climbing away from the performance space in a wide curve, and from the uppermost row, the faces of the performers are unreadable, the human faces, that is. The masks are perfectly readable. Each fixed expression carries its meaning across the full distance without difficulty. The grief is legible, the fear is legible, the authority and the supplication and the formal lamentation are all legible. What is not legible from any seat in the theater is the ordinary human face of the citizen of Athens, who inhabits each costume, breathing in the heat beneath the painted clay, playing the role assigned to them by the playwright and the occasion. The audience watches the masks. The masks carry the meaning, and somewhere inside each mask, the ordinary face breathes and waits. This is the image the ancient world lived with, not as an abstract philosophical puzzle, though it became that, but as a direct experience available to everyone who attended those performances, who walked through the civic spaces of Athens or Rome, who understood that the identity one presented to the world was shaped and constrained by forces larger than any individual will. The theatrical image was not a metaphor imported into philosophy from the outside. It was philosophy's way of thinking clearly about something that was already true of every life, every day, in every society that assigned its citizens roles and required those roles to be performed. Plato had questioned the role and found beneath it something more real. The Stoics had accepted the role and found beneath it something more free. Sophocles had dramatized the catastrophe of confusing the role with the person, and Epictetus, having been assigned the most extreme role the ancient world could assign, the role of property, of the socially invisible, had drawn the line that established, with quiet and permanent force, that the interior cannot be colonized by the exterior, that whatever mask circumstance forces onto the face beneath it remains its own. The actor in the lamplight lifts the mask, the theater fills with sound and attention, and the specific kind of communal seriousness that an afternoon of tragedy produces. Behind the mask, the man breathes and speaks the words and inhabits the role with the careful skill of long practice. The mask amplifies him. It makes him legible across distance. It carries his voice to the furthest stone seat and his expression to the highest tier. And when the performance ends and the audience disperses into the evening air and the actor sets the mask down on its shelf in the dim backstage room, the question that was always there returns to its ordinary shape, quieter, less amplified, but no less present. The question of who is there when nothing is being performed. The question that Epictetus answered, not with resolution, but with a line. On one side, what is yours? On the other, what is not? And the interior space between them, drawn in understanding rather than in stone, steady as the capacity to think clearly and the willingness to ask the question again tomorrow with the same honesty it was asked today. That line is a kind of shelter. It has been standing for a long time. The questions it encloses are old and patient, and they rest quietly in the dark of the mind, the way the stone theater rests in the dark of the hills, not demanding anything, not requiring performance, simply there, as they have always been there, holding the shape of a question that has never needed urgency to remain alive. In the winter of 1921, Carl Jung sat at the large oak desk in his library at Küsnacht on the shore of Lake Zurich and reached for a word that had been waiting in Latin for nearly 2,000 years. He had been watching his patients for more than a decade by then, watching the way they moved through their social worlds, the way they held themselves differently in the consulting room than they did, he imagined, at dinner or at the office or in the particular silence of their marriages. He had been watching the gap between what they presented and what, slowly, in the long hours of the analytic session, emerged from beneath the presentation. And the word he reached for, setting it down with a deliberateness that suggested he knew it would stay, was asterisk persona, asterisk, the Latin theatrical mask, the thing an actor held before his face so that his voice would carry to the furthest row. It was, he felt, exactly right. There is a particular quality to the act of naming something that has been circling without a name. The thing does not change when the word arrives. It was always what it was, but it becomes in some important sense visible for the first time. Jung had been watching the persona in his patients for years before he named it, and the naming gathered everything he had seen into one coherent shape, the face worn outward, the social membrane, the compromise that every human being constructs between who they sense themselves to be and what the world requires them to become. It was not, he was careful to note, a deception. It was a necessity, and it was, in one form or another, universal. The formal definition he set down in asterisk, psychological types, asterisk, published that year, was precise in the way that only a definition built from long observation can be. The persona, he wrote, is not a personal quirk or an individual failing. It is an archetype, a structural feature of the human psyche itself, present in every culture and every individual, irreducible to particular biography. It is the place where the private interior of a person meets the impersonal expectations of collective life, and what gets built there is always a kind of negotiation. How much of what I am will be legible to the world, and in what form will it be legible, and what must remain, for now, behind? Every person performs this negotiation, Jung argued from the earliest years. Every person constructs, out of the materials available to them, their family, their culture, their particular position in the social order, a face fit for the world they inhabit. What struck him, sitting in that library, was how the ancient theatrical term carried within it a truth the modern consulting room kept confirming. The Roman actor holding the mask before his face was not pretending to be what he was not. He was amplifying one aspect of the human, one emotion, one social type, one register of experience, and projecting it outward with enough force and clarity to reach an audience spread across stone tiers in the open air. The persona does something structurally similar. It amplifies certain features of the person and makes them legible across social distance. The competent professional, the reliable friend, the capable parent, the composed colleague. Each of these is real, not invented, not false, and each of them is also partial, shaped by what the situation requires, held in place by the needs of the relationship, or the institution, or the role. The library at Kusnacht was a large book-lined room that Jung had designed himself, part of the house he built for his family on the lake. He worked there in the mornings when he was not seeing patients, and in the evenings when the day's clinical hours had ended. He had a habit, his associates noted, of thinking with objects nearby, stones he had gathered from the lakeshore, small carved figures, a collection of texts that ranged from Guthi to ancient Gnostic manuscripts. In that room, surrounded by those objects, was thinking not only as a clinician, but as something closer to a philosopher of the psyche, someone trying to map the interior life of the human being with the same seriousness and care that earlier thinkers had brought to questions of knowledge, or ethics, or the nature of the good. The persona was one province of that map, and it was not the outermost province, it was the border. A lawyer at the end of a long day walks back from the courthouse along the same street she has walked for years. The afternoon is cooling. She carries her briefcase. The bearing of the courtroom, the precision, the weight of authority, the trained management of every register of tone is still visible in the set of her shoulders, in the particular economy of her movements. She is not performing anymore, not consciously, but the performance has not yet released her. The persona does not dissolve the moment the audience disappears. It has been worn long enough to hold its shape for a while after, the way a garment retains the body's warmth even after it has been set aside. She will notice this, perhaps, when she sits down in her kitchen and finds that the first few minutes of stillness feel strange, not uncomfortable exactly, but uncharacteristic, as though she is occupying a room in her own life that is slightly unfamiliar. The lawyer has not disappeared, but something that is not the lawyer has begun, slowly, to surface. Jung was not interested in cataloging professional roles as problems to be solved. He was interested in something subtler and more structural, the question of what happens when the gap between the persona and the rest of the person's interior life becomes too large, or too unexamined, or too rigid, because the persona is not only what we show, it is also what we exclude. And everything that is excluded from the face we turn toward the world does not simply cease to exist. It goes somewhere else. The function Jung described the persona as serving is genuinely important to understand, because it is tempting, hearing the language of mask and performance, to conclude that the persona is simply the problem, the false self, the obstacle, the shell that conceals what is real. Jung was insistent on this point. The persona is not the enemy of the psyche. It is one of its necessary instruments. Without it, the interior life would be exposed to every social current and collective demand without any mediating layer of protection. There are things that belong to the depths. Grief not yet ready to be spoken, desire not yet understood, confusion still taking its shape, and they are not well served by constant social exposure. The persona protects them. It gives the interior life the space to develop at its own pace, beneath the social surface. while the face that the world requires is held in place at the outer boundary. To have no persona at all, Jung argued, is as psychologically costly as having nothing but persona. A person with no functional social face, someone who brings the full unmediated weight of their interior life into every professional encounter, every casual exchange, every institutional interaction, is not, in Jung's view, more authentic. They are simply less protected, less functional, less able to move through the shared life of their community with the flexibility that shared life requires. The persona is social equipment. Like all equipment, it can be misused. Like all equipment, it can become so habitual that it stops being something one uses and starts being something one is. But its existence is not, in itself, a failure. The failure, and Jung spent considerable time in asterisk, psychological types, asterisk, and in later works tracing its contours, lies in what he called inflation. The word carries its ordinary meaning, something that is expanded beyond its proper size. In the psychic sense, inflation is the condition in which the persona and the self have ceased to be distinguishable from one another. The actor has forgotten there is a face behind the mask. The role has become, in the person's own experience, the whole of who they are. The authority figure who cannot access tenderness, even in private, the celebrity who experiences their public image as their actual identity, and who grows genuinely confused and frightened in the moments when the audience is absent. The caretaker who has so thoroughly inhabited the role of selfless provision that their own needs have become, to them, not suppressed, but simply invisible. Inflation is not the same as commitment. A person can be deeply committed to a role, can inhabit it with full seriousness and genuine care, while still retaining somewhere beneath the commitment the awareness that the role is a role, and that they are something more than it. What inflation removes is precisely that awareness. The distance collapses. The territory of the persona and the territory of the self become, experientially, one and the same. And when that happens, something important has been lost, not deliberately discarded, not even consciously noticed as missing, but absent in the way that a landscape can be absent from a life lived entirely indoors. A woman who has spent years inhabiting the role of selfless caretaker with great love and genuine commitment stands one evening at a window watching the street below. Her children are asleep. The house is quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when they have been loud for a very long time. She watches a couple walking below, unhurried, speaking to one another. Something moves in her that she cannot name. It is not sorrow exactly, and it is not regret, and it is not longing in any form she would recognize. It is more like the edge of a question she has not asked herself in a very long time, perhaps a question she has never quite asked in a form clear enough to answer. She stands there for a moment, at the window, in that unnamed feeling. Then the house shifts, or a child calls, and she turns back. Jung would have recognized that moment, not as a symptom, but as a signal. Something from the interior, from the parts of the psyche that the persona's necessary selectivity has been holding at a distance, pressing briefly and quietly toward the surface. Not a crisis, not a rupture, something more patient and more persistent than either, a murmur from a depth that has not forgotten it exists. Because everything that the persona excludes, everything that cannot be made to fit the face we show, everything too complicated or too contradictory or too vulnerable for the social surface, gathers in Jung's account somewhere else. He called it the shadow, and the relationship between the persona and the shadow is not incidental, it is structural. The brighter and more polished and more carefully maintained the social mask, the larger and more accumulated the material it has forced underground. This is not a metaphor Jung uses loosely. He means it with some precision. What cannot be acknowledged in the light tends to become, over time, what he called the shadow, the repository of everything the persona could not hold. The shadow is not simply the negative. It is not only the things about oneself that are difficult or dark. It can contain, with equal completeness, things that are simply too tender, too unformed, too strange, too contradictory to be worn at the social surface. The lawyer's grief, the executive's longing for rest, the public intellectual's private uncertainty, the performer's need for silence. None of these are failures or weaknesses in any simple sense. They are simply the parts of the person that the selected, amplified, socially legible face cannot accommodate, and so they accumulate over time in the interior. A person known to their colleagues and social circle as a figure of unruffled competence and enviable self-possession sits in a dream, standing in a corridor that extends in both directions without end. Their clothes in the dream are wrong, inadequate to the occasion, inadequate to the cold. They reach for words and find that what they need to say will not form into language. The corridor is not malevolent, it is simply indifferent and enormous, and they are standing in it without the equipment their waking life provides. The competence is not available here. The unruffled surface has no purchase on the walls of the corridor. What remains, whoever stands in the dream without the mask, is something rawer and more uncertain than the daylight version has been permitted to be. They wake from the dream into their ordinary room. The morning light arrives, the coffee is made, the day assembles itself, and with it the persona and the dream recedes, as dreams do, into something that happened in another country. Jung read this kind of dream with serious attention. He saw the shadow pressing upward through the one door the persona cannot guard. Sleep, and recognized in such dreams not a malfunction, but a communication. The psyche was not staging a critique. It was doing what the psyche does when it is healthy enough to speak, offering the information that the daylight hours have been suppressing in the only hours when the suppression has been suspended. There is something quietly paradoxical in the Jungian account that deserves to be held for a moment, in the way that paradoxes that resolve into something true deserve to be held. The persona is necessary. The shadow is the cost of the persona's necessity. The shadow is not a failure of character, but a consequence of the perfectly ordinary and structurally inevitable process by which any person constructs a social face. Everyone who has a persona, which is everyone, has a shadow. The shadow does not indicate that something went wrong. It indicates that something is alive in there, and complex, and larger than what the face can hold. What the shadow accumulates over years tends to develop a kind of pressure, not urgency in Jung's framing, but something more like mass. It is there. It is real. It is part of the person in a way that the persona's management of it cannot finally resolve. And this is where the idea of individuation enters, not as a clinical program or a therapeutic goal in any narrow sense, but as a description of what happens when a life, through whatever combination of circumstance and reflection and willingness, begins to make room for what it has been excluding. Individuation was Jung's term for the lifelong process by which a person gradually moves toward a more honest and whole relationship with the full range of their own interior life. Not a destination, not a completion, a direction. The persona remains, it must, because the social world is still there, still making its demands, still requiring a legible face at the boundary. But the relationship to the persona changes. Instead of identifying with it entirely, without remainder, a person in the process of individuation begins to hold it with a slightly different grip, wearing it, as it were, with more consciousness, more flexibility, more awareness that what is worn is not the same as what is wearing it. The process he imagined was not violent. He was careful about this. He did not describe individuation as the tearing away of false masks in an act of dramatic liberation, leaving the true self exposed and trembling in the light. The theatrical imagery is wrong for what he meant. What he meant was something considerably quieter and considerably longer, a gradual increase in the interior space available to the self, a slow opening of rooms that have been closed for a long time, each one slightly warmer and more honest than the corridor outside it. Jung had arrived at this idea through his own life as much as through his clinical work. In 1913 and 1914, following his break with Freud and the period of psychological turbulence that followed, he had kept what he called the Red Book, a private record of his encounters with his own unconscious, with the figures and images that arose from depths he had not fully mapped. He described this period later as a confrontation with his own shadow, a meeting with the parts of his own interior life that his persona as a respected physician and public intellectual had been holding at a considerable distance. He did not recommend this experience as universally available or universally appropriate, but he took it seriously, and it shaped everything he wrote afterward about the relationship between the social face and the interior depths. The desk at Kusnacht, where he worked in the winter of 1921, was not far from the tower he was building at Bollingen, on the upper lake, a stone structure he erected with his own hands over many years, adding rooms as the decades passed, visiting it in solitude, spending time there without electricity or telephone or the professional role the city required of him. He described Bollingen as the place where he was most fully himself, not the place where he abandoned his persona. He was always everywhere. Carl Jung, the analyst, the author, the thinker, but the place where the persona was loosened sufficiently that other things had room to move. He cooked his own meals there. He carved inscriptions in the stone. He sat by the lake in the evenings and watched the light change on the water. He was not performing anything for anyone. The tower was, in a sense, a made object that meant what individuation means, a space constructed deliberately for the purpose of holding more of the self than the social world ordinarily allows. Not a retreat from the persona, a rest from the persona's uninterrupted weight. What Jung had noticed, and what the winter of 1921 and the word asterisk persona asterisk allowed him to articulate clearly for the first time, is that the social world does not ask to hold all of a person. It asks for a face. It asks for a legible, functional, socially navigable surface. This is not a tyranny so much as a structural fact. The social world is large and various and impersonal, and it cannot receive, in every encounter, the full specificity and complexity and interior weather of every individual life. So the individual accommodates, the individual selects, the individual builds, over time, out of materials partly chosen and partly given, a face that can move through the shared world with the necessary efficiency and recognizability, and then, somewhere beneath that face, the rest of the life continues, slowly, in the dark, without applause, without an audience, without the social function that the persona performs at the surface. It continues because it is alive, and because aliveness does not wait for permission. The grief continues. The desire continues, the confusion continues, the longing for something unnameable continues. The question that was put down so many times it seems to have been forgotten continues, in the long patience of interior life, continuing. There is a quietness in Jung's understanding of this that can be missed if the clinical language draws too much attention to itself. The shadow sounds ominous. Inflation sounds like a disorder. But what he was describing, at its core, is simply the experience of being a person, in a social world that requires something intelligible from you, while you yourself remain, in large part, unintelligible even to your own careful attention. The mask is not the villain in this account. The mask is the equipment you needed and built and have been wearing since before you had the language to know you were wearing it. And it has done what equipment does. It has served, and in serving it, has also limited, and in limiting it has also accumulated, in the quiet places behind it, everything it could not hold. The process of beginning to recognize this, of noticing, even briefly, the weight of the mask and the existence of the face beneath it, is not a crisis in Jung's account. It is more like a door becoming visible, a door that has always been there, in the wall of the house one has been living in, but which the furniture of daily life had been arranged against. No one required the furniture to be moved. The house was perfectly habitable, with the door hidden, but there it is, once noticed, and it does not stop being a door. In the library at Kusnacht, the lake was barely audible in winter, a low, continuous sound that was more felt than heard. The books on the shelves represented centuries of thinkers who had sat in their own rooms with their own versions of this question. The gap between appearance and reality, between the social face and whatever lay behind or beneath it. Jung was sitting inside a very long conversation when he reached for the Latin word. He was not beginning something, he was continuing something. And the word asterisk persona, asterisk, which had named a mask worn in the ritual theater of ancient Rome, was still accurate, still fit for what he was watching in the modern consulting room, in the lives of people who came to him wearing their necessary faces, and who over the course of the work began to discover, slowly and without dramatic ceremony, that the face was not the whole of what they were. The individuation Jung described is not a program that ends. It does not arrive at a point where the persona has been fully seen through, and the true self stands finally and permanently revealed. There is no final backstage in his understanding, no ultimate unperformed version of the self, waiting to step forward once the theater is empty. There is only the ongoing and patient movement toward a more honest and more spacious interior life, a life in which more of what is real in the person has been, at least some of the time, acknowledged. The persona remains, the shadow remains. The gap between them, if attended to, remains generative, not dangerous, not shameful, but quietly alive, a room at the end of the day. The last light has moved off the ceiling, and the walls have gone to a pale gray that is not quite dark. The jacket has been removed, or the lanyard, or the professional posture, or whatever outer garment the particular day required. And in the few minutes before the next thought arrives, before the planning for tomorrow begins, or the events of today are reviewed, or the familiar self-narrative resumes, something is possible. Not enlightenment, not transformation, something considerably more ordinary than either, and perhaps more valuable. A brief moment of not performing, in a life that has been performing since morning, in which whatever is behind the face has a little room, a little air, a little time in which it has not been asked to be anything in particular. Jung would have recognized that moment, He would have recognized it as small and unspectacular and necessary in the way that small and unspectacular things are necessary when they are the only version of a thing that is actually available to a human life in motion. The tower at Bollingen was one version of it. The dream was another version. The evening window through which a woman watched an unnamed feeling move across the street was another. They are all the same movement, the persona relaxing its grip for a moment, not collapsing, not being torn away, simply loosening, and in that loosening, something from the interior, from the depth that has been patient, moving a little toward the surface. That door in the wall is not urgent. It asks nothing from the side of the room where the furniture has been arranged. It simply remains in the patient way that interior truths tend to remain, waiting without pressure for the moment when a person, coming to the end of a long day of wearing the necessary face, turns toward it with something that is not yet knowledge and not yet understanding, but is perhaps the first quiet stirring of a recognition that there is more in there than the world has had occasion to ask for, and that the more has been waiting, unhurried, all along. Erving Goffman is sitting in the lobby of a hotel in the late 1950s, and he is watching, not conspicuously. He has the stillness of someone who has learned to be present without appearing to be present, which is itself a kind of performance, though he would not have called it that yet. A bellman crosses the marble floor with a luggage cart, spine straight, expression helpful but not familiar, moving at a pace that is neither hurried nor leisurely, but calibrated, a pace that says, "I am at your service, and I am also entirely at ease." A guest at the front desk signs something, glancing up occasionally at the clerk with a look that is courteous without being warm. The clerk returns it. Both of them, Goffman noticed, were doing something. Both of them were managing. He had come to the study of social life from anthropology, and he brought to it the observing eye of someone accustomed to watching rituals in cultures not his own. What he saw in hotel lobbies, in hospital wards, in restaurants and offices, and ordinary rooms where ordinary people moved through ordinary afternoons, was this: the performance was everywhere, and it was never quite suspended. The bellman was not pretending to be a bellman while secretly being something else. He was performing the role with the particular combination of habit and intention that all social roles require, and the performance was real. It was not less real for being performed. That was the first, most important, and most easily missed thing. His book appeared in 1959. It was called Asterisk, the Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Asterisk, and its central claim was borrowed from the theater, though Goffman was careful to say it was only borrowed, an analogy, not an identity. All social interaction, he argued, is structured like theatrical performance. The individual entering a room, a conversation, a transaction, is always in some sense a performer. They are managing the impression they create. They are deploying manner, dress, expression, timing, word choice, all of it consciously or not, in order to produce a particular effect in the minds of the people watching. This was not cynicism. Goffman was not saying that social life is a deception, that people are hiding their true nature behind a false one. He was saying something at once simpler and stranger, that the presentation is constitutive, not merely decorative. The self that appears in social interaction is not concealing something more real behind it. It is what the self is, in that moment, in that room. In the theater, there is a front stage and a backstage. Goffman noticed this distinction already operating in every context of social life. The restaurant has its dining room, where the performance is in full execution, the staff attentive, the atmosphere carefully maintained, every element of the scene arranged for the audience of guests. And behind the kitchen door, there is another space governed by entirely different norms. The language changes, the posture changes, the hierarchies that are invisible on the floor become bluntly visible among the cooks. A waiter coming through that door, tray still balanced, transitions between two separate performances in the span of a single step. But Goffman pressed the point further than this, and in the pressing, it became something more interesting than a simple observation about restaurants. The backstage, he noticed, is not where the real self resides, unperformed and finally true. The backstage is another front stage for a different audience. The kitchen staff perform for one another. The friends venting in private perform the role of intimate confidant. The person alone in their apartment, in the small hours of an unobserved night, is not, or is rarely, simply present without any kind of frame. They organize their solitude. They narrate it. They are an audience of one to their own unwitnessed behavior. And even here, something like performance persists. The idea does not arrive with the sharpness of a blade. It arrives slowly, the way a fog moves in, and then once it is settled, it becomes difficult to see the landscape any other way. There is no final room. There is no backstage so private that it has altogether shed the logic of the front. The self recedes through each successive private space, still performing, still arranging, still managing the impression made on whoever, even on itself, is watching. Goffman drew this picture not to be unsettling, but because it was, as far as he could see, simply accurate. He was a precise observer, and what he observed was that impression management is not the province of the anxious or the calculating. It is a universal structural feature of social life, as natural and as constant as breathing. The person who walks into a room and thinks they are doing nothing particular is already doing something. They are maintaining a front, sustaining a presence, projecting a version of themselves that coheres with the expectations of the space they have entered. The philosopher might say that social life is constituted by these performances, that the roles are not worn over a pre-existing self, but are the forms the self takes as it moves through the world. A waiter in Paris in the late 1940s is moving between tables with a precision that draws the eye. Jean-Paul Sartre is at a corner table, drinking coffee, watching. The waiter's movements have a quality that Sartre will later describe as being just a little too perfectly what they are. The tray is level, with an accuracy that speaks of practice, elevated to artistry. The deference in the tilt of the head is so well calibrated that it has become indistinguishable from nature. And yet, here is the thing Sartre was watching for. It is not nature. The waiter is performing being a waiter with a completeness that has, in some sense, displaced the person who might, at any moment, set down the tray and walk out through the door and never return. That freedom, absolute, inescapable, the permanent condition of a being who is always ahead of whatever role it currently occupies, has been, temporarily and not entirely convincingly, suppressed. Sartre had been working, across the years of the occupation and its aftermath, on a philosophy of freedom so radical that it pressed against the outer walls of what most people were prepared to believe about themselves. The human being, he argued, is not a thing with a fixed nature. The stone in the road is simply what it is, fully, without remainder, a stone. But the human being is characterized by a fundamental gap between what it is and what it is doing, between its facticity and its transcendence. Every moment, the human being is ahead of itself, occulti. Every moment it is choosing, not choosing from a list of options provided by its nature or its circumstances, but choosing in the deepest sense what it is. The role is never the person. The role is always something the person is doing, and the doing can, in principle, be otherwise. He named the alternative mauvaise foi, bad faith. It is the state of pretending not to have this freedom, of inhabiting a role with such completeness that the gap between role and person seems to close, of treating the socially assigned identity as though it were a fact of nature rather than an ongoing choice. The waiter who has become so thoroughly a waiter that being a waiter feels like what he is rather than what he is doing. The bureaucrat who enforces a rule by pointing to the rule as if there were no person behind the pointing. The person who explains their behavior by reference to their character, their upbringing, their nature, all those explanations that place the cause of the action outside the freedom that actually performed it. Bad faith is not primarily moral failure, though it can have moral consequences. It is an ontological error, a misreading of what kind of being a human being is. Sartre was not accusing the waiter of dishonesty. He was describing a condition that runs through all of human social existence, a tendency so deep and so useful that it is almost necessary. The radical freedom Sartre had in mind is genuinely uncomfortable to hold, to know at every moment that one's identity is not fixed, that the role is always a choice, that no inherited nature settles the question of what one will do next. This is not a settled and pleasant thing to know. Bad faith offers relief from this knowledge. It offers the comfort of being, simply and without remainder, what one appears to be. Sartre distinguished between two modes of being to clarify what was at stake. Being for itself is the mode of human consciousness, restless, self-aware, always in some sense beyond itself, characterized by negation and the constant reaching forward into what it is not yet. Being in itself is the mode of objects, which simply are what they are, without any gap between their nature and their existence. A stone does not choose to be a stone. A hammer does not perform being a hammer, while secretly having the option to be otherwise. Bad faith is the attempt of a being for itself to pass as a being in itself, to pretend that the gap has closed, that the freedom has been settled, that the role has become the person, as the stone simply is a stone. The honest acknowledgement is that bad faith cannot be finally escaped, only interrupted. Sartre did not claim that a life of perfect authenticity was available, a life in which every moment was lived in full awareness of one's radical freedom, in which the role was always worn consciously and held at a clear distance from the person wearing it. What he pointed toward was something more modest and more sustainable. Moments of recognition, interruptions in the performance, instants in which the gap between role and person briefly becomes visible again, and the freedom that was always there, even during the longest and most convincing performance, reasserts itself quietly. Simone de Beauvoir had been working alongside Sartre, living a philosophical life that was in many respects continuous with his, and in 1949 she published a book that took the question of the performed self into territory Sartre had not followed it. Asterisk. The second sex asterisk opened with a question that had seemed to her, for some time, both obvious and strange. What is a woman? She had asked it genuinely, and the answer she found was not what the question might have led her to expect. She found that what presents itself as a natural category, womanhood, femininity, the female identity, is not natural at all in the sense of arising spontaneously from the biology or the inner life of the person who inhabits it. It is a construction. It is assembled over years by culture, by education, by the persistent force of expectation, by the accumulated pressure of a world organized around a particular set of ideas about what women are and what they are for. The feminine persona is not expressed by women, it is assigned to them, and through the long continuous work of socialization, internalized to the point where the assignment feels like a discovery of one's own nature. De Beauvoir had sat at tables in Paris cafes in the early 1940s, working through this in notebooks that she did not intend for any immediate audience. She was not writing about other women, or not only. She was writing about the particular experience of growing up inside a set of expectations that felt, from the inside, like the shape of one's own desires. The difficulty, and this is what gave the book its particular force, is that the mask fashioned by others and handed to one as a mirror is not, by the time one becomes aware of it, clearly separable from the face beneath it. The role has been so thoroughly assumed that its origins have become invisible. The feminine identity feels, to the person inhabiting it, like an expression of her nature, because she has inhabited it since before she was old enough to examine it. This is the point where de Beauvoir's account moves beyond the question of individual psychology and into the social and historical. The persona is not merely the result of each person's individual accommodation to social life, as Goffman's account might suggest. It is also the product of particular arrangements of power, particular historical formations that have served particular interests over long periods of time. The feminine persona, de Beauvoir argued, serves a world organized around the assumption that women's lives are secondary, that the female self is properly defined in relation to the male. To wear that persona without examination is not simply to enact a performance, it is to participate, however unwillingly and however unknowingly, in the reproduction of the structure that created it. She was not offering this as an accusation toward women who had so internalized the role that it felt like nature. That would have been to miss the entire force of what she was describing, which was precisely how invisible the socialization is when it is most thorough. She was pointing instead toward the possibility of examination, not the simple removal of the mask, which is in any case not available, but the gradual, deliberate, often difficult act of looking at the mask and asking where it came from and whose interests it serves, and whether, knowing what it is, one would choose it still. On a street in Paris in the spring of 1943, de Beauvoir walked through the occupied city with the particular doubled awareness that the time demanded, performing one thing on the surface, carrying something else beneath. She had been living this split for years, the recognized intellectual, the companion of Sartre, the woman who moved through academic life with the authority of a philosopher, and beneath all of it, the person who had begun to notice that even the most autonomous intellectual performance is shaped by forces it has not chosen. The notebook she carried was filling up with observations that would take years to become a book, and the book would take longer still to become something the world was ready to read steadily and without flinching. What she was working toward was not a prescription for how to live that would have been to replace one externally imposed frame with another. She was working toward a description of what the mask actually is, where it comes from, and why it is so difficult to see from the inside. The social persona is not merely a costume worn over an otherwise intact and freely chosen self. It is a structure that shapes the self as the self develops, so that the question of what lies beneath the persona cannot be answered by simply removing it. The removal reveals another layer, also shaped, also historical, also the product of forces that preceded the individual who bears them. Goffman and Sartre and de Beauvoir were each working on a different face of the same question, and the faces were not quite reconcilable. Goffman's account of impression management was sociological. It described a universal structure of social life, without asking whether that structure serves freedom or constrains it, without assigning praise or blame to the performer. The performance is simply what social life is. Sartre's account was ontological. It began from a claim about what human beings are, a claim that made the suppression of freedom a philosophical mistake rather than merely a social fact. De Beauvoir's account was political. It placed the question of the persona inside the question of power, asking not only what the mask is, but who benefits from its being worn. In a room in Chicago in the late 1950s, a graduate student reads Goffman's book in a single sitting and finds that every social encounter she has ever had looks different afterward, not worse, different. The bus ride has a choreography. The office meeting has a stage. The dinner party has a script that no one wrote, but that everyone is following, and the small variations from the script, the guest who is funnier than usual, the host who is less controlled, are legible precisely as variations against the expected pattern. Nothing has become fraudulent. What has changed is only the visibility of the structure that was always there. These three accounts, sitting beside each other without being forced into agreement, point towards something that each of them approached from a different angle. The mask is not merely a concealment. It is not a false surface laid over a true interior. The mask is doing something. It is constituting, in part, the self that wears it. The role shapes the person as the person enacts it, and the person doing the enacting is always more than any single role, which is precisely why the enactment feels, at its most convincing, like a kind of compression, a reduction of the available self to the portion the situation requires. The over-precise waiter sets down the coffee cup with a gesture that is almost but not quite too deliberate, and in that almost, in the small excess of precision, the flourish that is a degree too studied, Sartre saw the edge of the performance, the place where the role and the person are not quite the same thing, the seam, not visible under normal scrutiny, but there, always there, wherever a human being is performing what they are, rather than simply being it, which is everywhere and always, which is the condition. Goffman had noticed, in his hotel lobbies, in his hospital wards, in his restaurant dining rooms, that the performance is most visible at its edges, at the moments of transition between front stage and backstage, in the micro-expressions that escape management, in the pauses between the lines where something unscripted briefly surfaces. He called these slips, these momentary failures of impression management, and he noticed that they provoke a particular kind of social discomfort, not because dishonesty has been revealed, but because the performance has been disrupted. The fiction that the role is the person, a fiction everyone was maintaining together, has flickered. De Beauvoir's version of this flickering is the moment of becoming aware, the woman who, in the middle of a performance she has given so many times it has stopped feeling like a performance, notices that she is performing, not performing falsely, performing a role that was assigned before she could choose, rehearsed before she could evaluate, reinforced so consistently that evaluation had seemed, for a long time, beside the point. The noticing is not a crisis, and it is more like a shift in light, the familiar room seen from a slightly different angle, and in the new angle, a shadow that was always there but had not been attended to. A person walks into a room, and the room reorganizes itself around who they appear to be. This is not an observation about charisma or social power, though those are real. It is an observation about the structural logic of social space, which is always already arranged in expectation of a role, and into which each person steps by adopting the role the space is waiting for. The new employee performs being a new employee. The authority performs being authoritative. The friend performs being a friend, which is a real role with its own conventions, its own front and its own backstage, its own impression management that has become so habitual it has dissolved into what simply feels like friendship. Sartre would say that in each of these performances there is a moment, rarely attended to, usually passed over, when the freedom of the performer flickers into view. When being a friend feels for an instant like a choice rather than a nature. When the authority notices, in the middle of a sentence delivered with complete conviction, that the conviction is partly produced by the role and not only by the argument. These instants do not resolve into anything dramatic. They pass. The performance resumes, and the resumption is real. But something has briefly been visible that the logic of the performance is organized, ordinarily to keep invisible. What these three thinkers, working independently and across different disciplines, kept arriving at was the persistence of the self beyond any of its performances. Not a fixed self, a given nature, a stable essence that the role merely costumes, something more elusive, the awareness that is always slightly in excess of the role, always capable of noticing the role from a position outside it, always implicitly there, even in the most convincing performance. Sartre named this freedom. Goffman more cautiously noted the performer who is distinct from the performance. De Beauvoir spoke of the self that might be possible on the other side of examination, not a pristine self, uncorrupted by social formation, but a self that knows what it has been shaped by and chooses, knowing this, what to continue. The choice is not simple. De Beauvoir was clear that the persona cannot simply be discarded, that the structures of social life are not optional, and that the person who attempts to live entirely outside all social role is not liberated, but merely isolated. The choice is not between wearing a mask and not wearing one. It is between wearing a mask unknowingly in the belief that the mask is the face, and wearing it with the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing what it is. The second wearing is not more comfortable, but it is more honest. And there is a kind of ease in honesty, even when honesty is difficult, the ease of not having to maintain, in addition to the performance itself, the conviction that the performance is not a performance. Goffman's hotel lobby continues its choreography. The bellman moves across the marble floor, the posture calibrated, the expression correct. He passes through a door and his shoulders shift. The expression loosens, and he is inside a different performance, backstage, which has its own front. Sartre's waiter bends forward at the precisely correct angle. De Beauvoir fills the notebook at the cafe table, finding the words for something that has been true for a long time, but has not yet been named. All three of these thinkers were pointing at the same persistent thing from different positions, the gap between the role and the person, always open, always available to be noticed, never fully closed. An actor comes off stage after a long performance, one that has gone well. The house was full. The stillness of the audience during the difficult scenes was the stillness of genuine attention, and the applause at the end had the quality that every performer learns to distinguish from the polite kind. The stage manager says something brief and warm. The actor nods, still partly inside the character, the way a body stays warm for a while after the source of heat has been removed. They walk through the wings to the dressing room. The other performers are there, some of them still in costume, the room smelling of makeup and sweat, and the particular adrenaline of performance concluded. Gradually the character releases, not all at once. The borrowed voice settles back into the ordinary voice. The borrowed posture relaxes into the habitual one. But what remains, Goffman might ask, when the theatrical performance ends? Not the absence of performance. Another performance, smaller, less elaborate, governed by the norms of a different room. The performer in the dressing room after the show is still managing something, is still presenting a self, perhaps the self of the modest and slightly drained artist, the collegial professional, the person who was present enough to be vulnerable in front of an audience, and who is now, carefully, reassembling the ordinary social surface. The rooms recede, the self recedes through them. Sartre might point to the walk home from the theater as the moment alone on the pavement, in the dark and the cold, with no audience but the empty street. This is where the freedom that was suppressed all evening in the service of a role pushes back up toward consciousness, not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a revelation, simply as a quality of the silence, the awareness of being, briefly outside the structure of impression management, in the gap between one performance and the next. The gap is short. The next performance will begin when the door opens at home, or even before that, in the preparation for the next encounter. But the gap is real, and in it something breathes that has no name in the vocabulary of social roles. De Beauvoir might say that the walk home is also historical, that even the solitude on the pavement is shaped by forces that preceded the individual walking through it. The street is organized in ways that are not neutral. The experience of moving through public space alone at night carries different meanings for different bodies, and those meanings are not chosen. They arrive already attached to the person before the person has decided anything about them. The persona pressed upon one by social life does not stop pressing at the theater door. It is continuous. And yet, and this was the tension de Beauvoir sustained without resolving it, the examination is possible, the noticing is possible, the slow, deliberate, imperfect work of knowing what one has been shaped by, and choosing in that knowledge, is available even in conditions that did not invite it. The philosophical problem of the persona, as these three accounts together trace it, is not that the mask exists. The mask cannot be eliminated from social life without eliminating social life. The problem is the quality of relationship one has with the mask, whether the wearing is knowing or unknowing, chosen or merely endured, examined or taken for granted as natural. What Goffman described as the structural fact of impression management, what Sartre named as the freedom that persists behind every role, what de Beauvoir analyzed as the historical construction of social identity. Each of these is a different entry point into the same sustained question: what is actually being worn, and by whom, and chosen by what? A person sits alone in a room at the end of an ordinary day. The day has contained its usual performances: the professional, the neighbor, the competent adult who manages what is required of them, the social self who calibrates warmth and distance with the practiced ease of long habit. The room is quiet. No one is watching in the way that rooms full of other people watch. The particular quality of attention that social performance requires has, for a moment, been suspended. In that suspension, not resolving anything, not delivering any revelation, simply present, something quieter than any of the day's performances, is briefly, simply there. It does not announce itself. It requires nothing from the person in the room. It is simply what remains when the performance has for a moment been set down, not the truth behind the mask, in some simple and dramatic sense, something more patient and less certain than that. The question of who is there, and whether any answer to it can survive the morning's return to the stage, rests in the quiet of the room without urgency, open and unhurried, as such questions tend to be. In the early morning of a day in the 5th century before the Common Era, somewhere in the forests near the river town that would one day be called Bodh Gaya, a man sat beneath a fig tree and did not move. He had been sitting for a long time. The night had passed. The birds had gone through their cycles of silence and sound. The light had changed from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a North Indian dawn. And throughout all of this, the man beneath the tree had remained where he was, not because he was performing stillness, but because something inside him had reached, in those hours, a kind of resolution so complete that movement had simply ceased to be necessary. What had resolved was not a problem in the ordinary sense. No argument had been won. No answer had been written down. What had shifted in the sitting was something much harder to name, a recognition that had moved through him, not like a thought, but like weather, like a change in atmospheric pressure that altered everything it passed through without announcing itself at all. The social roles that had organized his life until that point, the nobleman's son, the devoted husband, the spiritual seeker, were still technically his. Nothing had removed them, and yet, in the quiet on the other side of that long night, they had become transparent in a way they had never been before. He could see through them to something that had always been there underneath, and what was underneath was not another, deeper self. What was underneath was open and clear and still. This is what the tradition that gathered around him would eventually call awakening, not the acquisition of something new, the recognition of something that had always been present, waiting patiently beneath every costume the world had ever handed over to be worn. The question that runs through the oldest Buddhist texts is deceptively simple. It asks what is actually here, not what should be here, not what seems to be here from the outside, not what the social world has agreed to call here, but what is actually present when the agreements are set aside and the looking is done quietly and without expectation. What is found when the examination is pursued far enough is not a self in the way the word is usually understood. What is found is more like a process, or a flow, or a field of experience in which discrete events arise and pass away with no fixed center looking on from outside. The word the Buddhist tradition settled on for this was asterisk, anatta, asterisk, non-self, the teaching that what we take to be a stable, unified, continuous self, the same person who went to sleep last night and woke up this morning, the same person who has a name and a history and a set of recognized traits, is not the kind of thing it appears to be. It is a continuously changing river of physical sensations, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and moments of awareness. And what holds these together into the appearance of a unified self is not an essence but a habit, a deeply grooved, remarkably persistent, almost entirely unconscious habit of gathering disparate experience into a story called asterisk me, asterisk. The persona, in this light, is one particularly visible layer of a larger confusion. The social role, the face worn outward, the performance mounted for others, is built on top of something that was already built. Beneath the persona worn in public is a private self that also turns out, on examination, to be constructed. Beneath that private self is a body with its hungers and rhythms. Beneath that is a stream of passing sensation. And somewhere in the following of that stream, back toward its source, the seeker who began the investigation finds, instead of an investigator, only the investigating, only the open, moving, formless process of experience itself, awake to what is happening, attached to none of it in particular. The release this recognizing brings is described in the texts as asterisk nibbana, asterisk, a cooling, a going out, as of a flame that has run out of fuel to consume. Not a blankness, not a nothing, but the specific relief of a mind that has stopped clinging to what it took itself to be, and found that what is left, when the clinging stops, is not diminished. It is, the text suggests, considerably lighter. In the Zen tradition that developed in Japan from these same roots, the question of the mask was posed not as a philosophical argument to be followed, but as a practical impossibility to be worked with. The teacher would sit across from the student, and the question would be offered not to be answered, but to be entered. What was your face before your parents were born? What were you before you were given a name? Before the language, before the culture, before the network of social relations that organized your sense of who you are into its current recognizable shape, what was present then? The student reaches back. The student reaches through the memory of childhood, through the earliest years, through the imagined moment of birth, through the 9 months before that, through the lives of the parents, through the lineages extending backward, each generation handing something forward, until the reaching itself arrives at a boundary beyond which the personal story simply has no traction. And then the question is still there, still asking, still pointing at something the conceptual mind cannot hold. The koan does not want an answer that can be spoken. An answer that can be spoken is still a persona, still a construction made of language and inherited understanding, still a mask, however subtle. What the koan wants is the silence on the other side of all such answers. The moment when the student stops reaching and simply rests in the reaching. The face before parents were born is not a face at all. It is the awareness that was present before the first role was assigned, and that is present still, underneath every role that has been assigned since, and that will be present when the last role is finally set down. The Zen teacher might sit across from the student for months, asking the question, listening to the answers, and setting each answer gently aside. Not this either, not this. The setting aside is not a rejection, it is a pointing. Keep going, past the known, past the comfortable, past the familiar story of who this is. Keep going until the going itself relaxes into something that was always already arrived. There is a quality of humor in some of the Zen accounts of this process. The masters had a way of describing awakening that was not solemn, but almost amused, as though the whole elaborate effort of the search had led the searcher to the place where the search began, and the relief of arriving was inseparable from the recognition of the absurdity of ever having left. The mask was always already transparent. The face beneath it was always already visible to anyone willing to look. The whole theater of self-construction, examined carefully enough, was seen to be as thin as paper, as light as smoke, and as unnecessary as a door in an open field. Moving along the ancient Silk Road, westward through Central Asia, southward through the passes that lead into the Indian subcontinent, the same broad question of appearance and reality surfaced in a tradition older still. In the texts of early Taoism, which gathered around the figure of a keeper of the frontier archives called Laozi, sometime in the 6th century before the Common Era, the problem of the persona was not framed in terms of the self's construction, but in terms of its effortful maintenance. The Tao Te Ching, the short, knotted, endlessly debated text attributed to Laozi, opens with the admission that the Tao it is about to discuss cannot be contained in the language that would contain it. The name that can be fixed is not the enduring name. What the text is pointing at runs beneath all description, beneath all categorization, beneath all the labels that the mind uses to organize experience into manageable shapes. And the persona, the social surface, the managed impression, the carefully maintained face of competence or status or virtue, is one of the most elaborate of these organizational efforts, one of the heaviest masks to carry. The concept the Taoist tradition used as its alternative was *Wu Wei, effortless action, action that arises not from the anxious management of how one appears, but from deep alignment with what is natural, with the particular way that this specific life, this specific nature, flows most easily when it is not forced. The images in the Tao Te Ching reach for this repeatedly, reaching always downward. Water, the valley, the empty vessel. These images share a quality of receptivity and ease, of movement that follows rather than leads, of achievement that does not announce itself and cannot be extracted from the background against which it occurs. Water, the text observes, benefits all things and seeks only the lowest places, the places that others overlook or avoid. It does not compete. It does not perform. It does not spend energy maintaining an image of itself as something particular. It simply follows the shape of whatever receives it, and in doing so, it shapes even stone over the long, slow course of years, without effort, without drama, and without the slightest performance of its own remarkable power. The persona, from a Taoist perspective, is precisely what is lost when the natural flow is interrupted by the effort to appear. The person who must project authority reveals by the effort of the projection that the authority is not settled in them. The person who performs serenity reveals in the performance that the serenity is not yet real. The face worn outward is always a symptom of the gap between what is present and what is wished for, a gap that *Wu, Wei asterisk, does not close by effort, but dissolves by releasing the effort that created it. This was developed in a different register by the writer Zhuangzi, whose stories and dialogues appeared in roughly the same period as the Tao Te Ching and shared its central intuitions while deploying them in scenes of great comic extravagance. The cooks and craftsmen and butterflies that populated the Zhuangzi embody *Wu Wei, not as a doctrine to be argued for, but as a quality to be demonstrated, a kind of masterful engagement with the world that has left the anxious theater of self-presentation so far behind that it is no longer even remembered as something abandoned. A cook, in one of the most famous passages, cuts through an ox with such fluid precision that the blade never finds resistance, never dulls, moves always through the natural spaces in the structure of the thing, rather than against it. He does not perform butchery. He has become something that might be called butchery's own understanding of itself. The mask of the artisan and the artisan have become indistinguishable, not because he has lost himself in the role, but because the role inhabited at this depth has become transparent, and what shows through it is something much simpler and much less troubled than any self-image could be. Zhuangzi told the story of waking from a dream in which he had been a butterfly, drifting through a dream of its own, and asking afterward whether he was a man who had dreamt of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being a man. The question is not answered. It is left to hover lightly in the space between fixed categories, a small illustration of the general case. All identity is this provisional, this dreamlike in its foundations, this uncertain at its edges. The particular identity called Zhuangzi is no more or less real than the identity called butterfly. Both are temporary shapes that experience takes on, moving through forms the way the Tao itself moves, without insisting on any of them, without clinging to any of them, without performing any of them for an audience that could ever be said to finally matter. Eastward and southward again, in the tradition that developed along the banks of the Ganges, in the centuries surrounding the Common Era's beginning, the question of appearance and reality was given its most systematic and arguably most radical philosophical treatment. The Advaita Vedanta school which reached its classical formulation in the thought of a young philosopher from Kerala who walked the entire length of India in bare feet in the 8th century of the Common Era, held that the multiplicity of separate selves was not merely an error of individual psychology, but the fundamental structure of cosmic illusion itself. Adi Shankaracharya was, by the accounts that survive, a figure of extraordinary intellectual force who spent his short life. He died, the tradition says, at 32, traveling from philosophical debate to philosophical debate, working through the argument that the apparent world of distinct and separate things was not a collection of real substances, but an appearance arising within a single, undivided, self-luminous awareness. The Sanskrit term for this appearance was Maya, often translated as illusion. The word carries something more nuanced than mere falseness. Maya describes the way in which what is real, the undivided awareness of Brahman, the ground of all being, appears to itself as something it is not, as a world of multiplicity, as a field of separate selves, each one enclosed in a body, each one carrying a story, each one wearing the particular face that its circumstances have fashioned for it. The persona, on this account, is not merely a social construction. It is one particularly local expression of the cosmic process by which the single awareness mistakes itself for many. The individual face worn outward, the professional, the parent, the reliable one, the seeking one, is a mask worn by something that was never a separate self to begin with. And beneath it, not the private self that knows the public self to be partly performance, and not the unconscious depths beneath that private self, but Brahman itself, the awareness that is the ground of all experience, that is never absent from any moment of experience, that is looking through every pair of eyes that has ever looked, that is present in this moment as the simple fact of there being an experience at all. Shankaracharya's argument in the Vivekachudamani, the crest jewel of discrimination, proceeds by a systematic process of elimination. He distinguishes the witnessing awareness from each layer of what it witnesses. The body is not the self. The body changes, ages, is injured, replaced cell by cell, and the awareness watching it does not change in the same way. The mind is not the self. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions arise and pass. The stream of mental content flows continuously, and the watching is not itself flowing. Even the subtle sense of being an individual watcher, the feeling of interiority, the sense that there is a particular someone here noticing things. This too, the argument goes, is itself an object appearing within awareness. When everything that can be witnessed has been set aside, what remains is not a self in the usual sense. What remains is the witnessing itself, pure, unqualified, not located anywhere in particular, not bounded by anything at all. This remainder is what he called Atman, and Atman *. He argued with a consistency that startled and disturbed his contemporaries, is identical with Brahman *. The deepest layer of the individual is the ground of the universe. The awareness that remains when every mask, every role, every constructed layer of self has been examined and set aside is the same awareness that permeates and constitutes everything that exists. The distance between the small masked self and the open sky is exactly zero. It has always been exactly zero. The mask made it appear otherwise, and the mask was made of nothing more substantial than the long accumulated habit of taking it seriously. The metaphor that Shankaracharya returned to across multiple texts was the clay and the pot. A pot made of clay is in one sense real. It holds water, it sits on a shelf, it has a particular shape and weight that distinguishes it from other pots. But it is also, in another sense, nothing but clay that has temporarily taken on the form of a pot. The clay is the substance. The pot is the form the clay is wearing. When the pot is broken, nothing has been lost. There is only the clay again, waiting to take on another shape. The individual self is the pot. Brahman is the clay, and the pot, examined carefully enough, was never anything other than the clay wearing a temporary form. In the Mahabharata, the ancient epic in which the asterisk Bhagavad Gita, asterisk is embedded like a jewel set in silver. The moment of philosophical crisis arrives on a battlefield at dawn. Arjuna is there to fight. He has a function. He has a role. The warrior, the defender of right order, the one whose skill with the bow is legendary, the nephew, the friend, the kshatriya, bound by his asterisk dharma asterisk to this particular moment on this particular field. And facing him, across the ranks, are men he loves, his teachers, his cousins, his grandfather. The knowledge that the battle will require him to kill them undoes, in an instant, the whole supporting structure of his identity as a warrior. The role that had organized his understanding of himself has turned out to contain, at its core, an impossibility. He lowers his bow. He sits down in the chariot. He tells Krishna, who is driving, that he cannot do this. What follows is not a practical solution to the problem of killing family members. What follows is an extended philosophical education in which the problem is dissolved from the inside out, not by being solved, but by being reframed at a level of depth at which the problem no longer appears in its original form. Krishna teaches not the warrior, but the awareness beneath the warrior. He teaches not the nephew or the student or the friend. All of those are roles, all of those are masks, but the consciousness that has been wearing those masks, and that can, with sufficient clarity, come to recognize what it actually is. The teaching turns on a distinction. There is action performed in the grip of the belief that the performer is a fixed, separate self, whose survival and approval and success are what fundamentally matter. And there is action performed from a different understanding entirely, action undertaken because it is what this moment calls for, because it accords with what is right, because the nature of the situation demands it, and then released without attachment to the outcome, without the need for the result to confirm the story of who the actor is. This is what Krishna means by asterisk nishkama karma, asterisk action without desire for its fruits, action that serves the order of things rather than the maintenance of a particular self's preferred image of itself. The warrior does not become less a warrior in this teaching. Arjuna does not set down the bow and become a philosopher. The role remains. The asterisk dharma asterisk remains. What shifts is the relationship to the role, the degree of identification between the one playing the part and the part itself. The mask is still worn. The mask must be worn because there is a battle and there is a role, and both are real within the terms of the world that has produced them. But the wearing is conscious. The wearing is chosen. The wearing is held lightly enough that the one doing the wearing never forgets, in the midst of the performance, what they actually are beneath it. This is what the Gita offers as its central resolution, not the dissolution of the social self, but the liberation of the awareness within it. Not the removal of the mask, but the refusal to mistake the mask for the face. The performance of asterisk dharma, asterisk without the bondage of identification. The full, committed, excellent inhabitation of the role, paired with an inward freedom that the role can never fully reach or reduce, a kind of double awareness, one eye on the performance and one eye on the open space from which the performance arises. There is a practice mentioned in multiple Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist texts that illuminates what this double awareness feels like from the inside. It is the practice of sitting quietly after the day's activities have ended and simply observing what is still happening. Thoughts continue, perceptions continue, the breath continues, rising and falling with no instruction from the one who is watching it rise and fall. The social identities that organize the day's activity, the competent, the responsible, the adequate, the seen, begin without being pushed to thin. They do not disappear, but their claim on the attention relaxes. The need to maintain them, to defend them, to perform them for the benefit of some imagined audience, becomes in the stillness less urgent, less like a necessity, and more like a habit that can be noticed without being followed. What the meditator finds, when the habits are noticed but not followed, is not emptiness in the desolate sense. The traditions are consistent on this. What is found in the stillness is not the absence of experience, but a more direct acquaintance with experience itself, before it is organized into the story of a self that is having it. The warmth of the body, the weight of the floor beneath it, the sound of the room, whatever sounds a room at this hour holds, the simple, unelaborated fact of being here, awake, present, neither performing nor watching a performance, neither wearing a mask nor having removed one, because in this depth of quiet, the distinction between the masked and the unmasked has lost its ordinary sharpness. The ancient Indian concept that held all of this together, the awareness that is present beneath every layer of constructed self, beneath every social role, beneath every mask, and every face beneath the mask, was described in the tradition as asterisk Sat Ananda, asterisk, being, consciousness, and bliss. Three qualities that are not really three, but three ways of pointing at the same indivisible thing, the being that is not in opposition to non-being, but simply is, without condition or qualification, the consciousness that is not a consciousness of something else, but pure awareness, self-luminous, not dependent on any object for its own recognition, and the quality called asterisk, Ananda asterisk, which is often translated as bliss, but carries in the original something closer to the equanimity of something that has nothing to lose. The ease of what is already whole. A meditator at the end of a long practice session feels this, faintly, on the edges of the sitting. The familiar social identities have settled during the hour of stillness. The professional who carries the day's decisions, the parent whose love is wound up in worry, the one who tries to appear more certain than they feel, who tries to appear more composed than they are, who tries to appear more finished and resolved than any actual human life ever quite manages to be. These have settled, the way silt settles in still water, down toward the bottom, and what is visible in the water above them is clearer, not empty, clearer. The simple, unperformed, unwitnessed fact of being awake in a body that is alive, in a moment that is real, in a world that extends in all directions without requiring any particular arrangement of the self in order to continue. This clarity is not a peak experience. It is not the arrival at something new. It is the recognition of something old, older than any role, older than any mask, older than the story that has been accumulating since childhood into the particular face worn through this particular life. The Buddhist texts call it the original mind. The Taoist texts call it the return. The Vedantic texts call it remembering, because the word asterisk vidya asterisk, knowledge, wisdom, carries within it the sense not of acquiring information, but of recognizing what was already known, of removing the obscuration rather than adding anything that was absent. The stars above Bodh Gaya were beginning to fade when the man beneath the fig tree first opened his eyes on the morning of his awakening. The particular quality of the light, gray turning toward gold, the birds resuming their conversation, the air cool with the exhalation of the forest, was not, the tradition suggests, anything he had never seen before. He had seen mornings before. He would see many mornings after. What was different was the seeing. The way the seeing was no longer tangled up in the need to be a particular someone doing the seeing. The way the world arrived without the mediation of a self that required the world to confirm it. For a long time he sat with this. The role that was waiting for him, the teacher, the guide, the one who would carry the discovery back to those who had not yet made it, was not yet assumed. He was in those moments simply present, wearing no particular face, available to the morning in a way that the masks of his former life, the nobleman's son, the earnest ascetic, the desperate seeker, had never quite allowed. The simplicity of it was, by the accounts that survive, what most struck those who encountered him later and tried to describe what they had seen. Not the wisdom exactly, though the wisdom was there, the simplicity, the quality of a human being who had put something down that most people carry every waking hour of their lives, and had found that without it, everything was still there. The morning, the light, the breath, the open, quiet, patient awareness, steady as the sky behind clouds, present beneath every performance, waiting unhurried and complete. On the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, in the year 170 or thereabouts, the emperor lay in his tent with a small oil lamp still burning and a stylus in his hand. The army was encamped along the Danube. There was cold outside the leather walls, and Marcus Aurelius, commander of legions, ruler of provinces that stretched from the Scottish highlands to the Mesopotamian plains, was writing to himself in Greek, a language no one in that camp expected him to use, about thoughts no one in that camp would ever be invited to read. He did not write for an audience. There was no audience. The notes he made in those years, on campaign, in winter quarters, in the residual quiet after councils and dispatches and the long administrative labor of empire, were private in a way that very few documents from antiquity are private, not private as in confidential, private as in addressed to no one, performing nothing, expecting no response, a man setting down the imperial mask at the end of the day with the same deliberate quietness with which he would have removed a cloak, and then sitting with whatever was underneath. What he found underneath was not different from what anyone finds late at night when the day's performances have run their course. There was impatience that needed watching. There was grief that had been folded away. There was the recurring recognition that very little of what seemed urgent in the morning looked the same by lamplight. He called the interior space he was trying to inhabit the inner citadel, a place that external circumstances could besiege but not enter. A fortification built from reason and from the steady practice of looking honestly at oneself without either harshness or indulgence. From that place, the emperor's mask and the philosopher's mask and the general's mask were all visible as masks, useful, necessary even, but not the thing itself. He returned to this practice night after night, year after year. The notes accumulated without design. There was no argument being built toward a conclusion, no system being assembled for posterity. There was only the repeated act of a man setting down what he was supposed to be, and examining with patient and undefended attention what he actually was. The distance between those two things was never fully closed. He seems to have known it never would be, and there is something in the steadiness of his returning, despite that, which amounts to its own kind of answer. The day ends somewhere for everyone. The performance trails off, the audience disperses, the expressions calibrated for particular rooms become unnecessary, and something else, less legible, less deliberate, less performed, begins to surface in the space the performance vacated. This is not the dramatic unmasking of theatrical tradition, not the moment of revelation in which the villain's true face is shown. It is quieter than that, and more familiar. The voice changes slightly when no one is listening. The posture shifts. The part of the face that has been working all day, the ready smile, the interested attention, the patient authority, goes slack in ways that would be invisible to anyone watching, if anyone were watching, which is the point. Marcus Aurelius called the place the persona cannot reach the inner citadel. The phrase carries a particular kind of weight because it acknowledges that siege is always possible. The social world presses inward. The demands of role and rank and expectation arrive continuously, and even the most philosophically cultivated mind finds itself shaped by them over hours and days and years without always noticing. The citadel is not impregnable by nature. It must be maintained. It must be returned to, deliberately, the way he returned to those private pages in a tent on a cold river's edge, setting down the emperor in order to find the man. There is an image Kierkegaard carried with him through the Copenhagen of the 1840s, a city where he was, by all accounts, a celebrated and somewhat unsettling figure, visible in the streets, sharp in conversation, known for a quality of attention that made people feel simultaneously seen and exposed. He was charming in a way that was also clearly effortful, and the effort showed, not as insincerity exactly, but as a kind of brilliance that was performing its own brilliance. He wrote about this mode of existence from the inside, with the precision of someone who had inhabited it long enough to understand its architecture, the aesthete, the one whose life is organized entirely around the surface, around the management of impression and the cultivation of what appears. The aesthete, in Kierkegaard's account, is not simply vain. The aesthete is genuinely skilled. The aesthetic mode of life requires real intelligence and real sensitivity, the ability to read rooms, to modulate tone, to find the angle from which any encounter becomes interesting or beautiful, or at least tolerable. What it cannot do, and this is what Kierkegaard had noticed from the inside, is sustain. The aesthetic life has no ground. When the performance ends, when the party is over and the walk home begins in silence, there is an interior weather that the performance had been displacing, and in the silence it returns, unfamiliar and without name, not suffering exactly. Something closer to the faint nausea of a room where all the windows have been closed for too long. The move Kierkegaard described, from the aesthetic life, organized around appearance, to something he called the ethical life, organized around genuine interior commitment, is not dramatic in the way philosophical movements are sometimes described. It is not a sudden insight or a clean break. It is more like the slow realization that the performance has been costing something, that the debt has been accumulating in ways that the performance was designed to prevent anyone, including oneself, from noticing. And somewhere in that realization, not loudly but with a quiet persistence, the question arrives: what would remain if the performance were set down? What would remain? Nietzsche asked something like this question, but he came at it from a different angle, with a different temperament, and a different level of impatience with comfortable answers. He was not interested in the inner citadel, not convinced that virtue lay in faithfully inhabiting the role assigned by a larger divine order. He was interested, with an intensity that his prose could barely contain, in the question of which masks were genuinely one's own. He had noticed, and the observation runs through the work he produced in the 1880s, through the aphorisms and the polemics, and the genealogies, and the strange late hymns to life, that most people wear masks they did not choose. They inherit them. The values embedded in the masks were fashioned by history, by religion, by the accumulated sediment of social expectation, and handed down as though they were simply the shape of reality. The task, as Nietzsche understood it, was not to remove all masks. He had no patience for that kind of naive transparency, but to examine which masks were genuinely fashioned from the material of one's own nature, and which were simply what one had been handed. He called the person engaged in this examination the artist of oneself. The phrase is easy to read as grandiose, but the image he had in mind is quieter than it sounds. Not the artist as public performer or celebrated genius, but the artist as someone at a workbench, alone, attending carefully to material, discarding what does not belong, working slowly toward a shape that is genuinely and without pretension one's own. The self-overcoming he described is not the violent rejection of all inherited form. It is the patient, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable labor of determining what, of everything one has been given, actually fits. This labor is not performed for anyone. That is its whole character. The moment it is performed, the moment the self-examination becomes a public display of self-examination, the moment the mask of the unmasked is put on, it becomes precisely the thing it was meant to escape. Nietzsche knew this, and it made his position genuinely difficult to hold. The artist of oneself works in private, by lamplight, in the hours when no one is watching. The result, if there is a result, is not a final authentic self unveiled for public consumption. It is a quality of relation to one's own life, more honest, less borrowed, less shaped by the fear of how it looks. Emerson had reached towards something similar 40 years earlier, writing alone in Concord, Massachusetts, in the early 1840s, in a prose style that moved like weather, dense and illuminated, and difficult to hold in a single steady gaze. He was trying to name what was lost when a person organized their life entirely around the approval of others. Not something dramatic, not something catastrophic, a certain access, a certain thread of genuine perception that runs through a life when it is being lived from its own center, rather than from the projected and managed surface that faces the social world. He walked the fields near his house in Concord, and what he noticed there, about light, about season, about the way a thought arrives before it has been approved by anyone, struck him as belonging to a category of experience that social life was perpetually threatening to displace. The deeper self, in Emerson's account, speaks in intuitions rather than opinions. It does not argue, it perceives, directly and without intermediary, and then offers what it has perceived to the conscious mind, which must then decide whether to trust it or defer to what is publicly sanctioned. The deference, when it comes, is rarely experienced as capitulation. It arrives as prudence, as social grace, as the reasonable accommodation of someone who lives among others and must get along. And these are genuine goods. Emerson was not dismissing the social world or the obligations that come with living in it. He was noticing that the accommodation, over time and without examination, could become so complete that the original thread of genuine perception became harder to locate, not gone, but quieter, pressed down beneath the accumulated weight of maintained appearances, of approved opinions, of the careful presentation of a self that would not alarm or confuse or disappoint the people whose regard it depended on. Self-reliance, as he meant it, was not stubbornness or indifference to others. It was the practice of remaining in contact with that quieter thread, returning to it, trusting it, allowing it to be the ground from which engagement with the world proceeded, rather than a casualty of that engagement, something to return to at the end of the day, when the social world had made its demands and the performance had served its purposes, and there was at last no one left to perform for. There is a question that has followed this whole long philosophical conversation across centuries and traditions, present in Marcus Aurelius's tent, and in Kierkegaard's Copenhagen drawing rooms, and in Nietzsche's notebooks, and in Emerson's Concord fields, never quite answered, but never quite abandoned either. The question of who is there when no one is performing, who or what occupies the inner citadel, what remains, genuinely remains, when the mask is set down and the social membrane is no longer needed, and the labor of managing impression has paused. The question is harder than it appears. One answer, offered with patient honesty by a long philosophical tradition, is that there is no fixed and final self, hiding behind the masks, waiting to be revealed. The masks go all the way down, or something like that. The self that examines the mask is itself a kind of provisional formation, a pattern in experience rather than a substance, more like a river than a stone. This answer has produced distress in some people who encounter it, and relief in others, and the difference between those responses says something about what they were hoping to find. The distress comes from the expectation that there should be something solid underneath. The relief comes from the recognition that the expectation itself may have been the source of the weight. Marcus Aurelius, returning to his private pages night after night, was not finding a fixed self each time. He was performing an act of attention, looking honestly at what was present, without inflation and without dismissal, and then setting that down too. The practice mattered. The repeated, unhurried, unperformed returning was the thing, not the destination it was building toward, because there was no destination. Just the practice itself, and the particular quality of steadiness it produced in someone who had been all day a performance and could be, for a few hours of lamplight and Greek prose, simply a person attending to the actual contents of his own experience. Heidegger had a name for the social force that makes this returning so difficult. He called it das Man, the anonymous they, the impersonal authority that governs so much of ordinary life without anyone having chosen it or even consciously noticed it. Not a specific person or institution, not a law or a rule, something more diffuse and more total, the background assumption of what one does, what one values, how one speaks and moves and spends time, drawn from no particular source, but enforced through the continuous subtle pressure of belonging, of legibility, of not standing out in ways that attract the wrong kind of attention. Das Man is not malevolent. This is important. It is simply structure, the structure of social existence, the accumulated grammar of how people live together, which anyone who has ever tried to spend an extended period entirely outside social expectations will know is harder to escape than it initially appears. It follows inward. It shapes not just behavior, but the interpretation of experience, the language available for describing what one feels, the categories through which one understands what one wants. Authentic existence, in Heidegger's account, is not a permanent escape from this structure. It is a particular quality of relation to it, the difference between inhabiting it unconsciously and inhabiting it with a clarity about what it is and what it is not. The clarity is provoked, in his account, by certain experiences that cut through the anonymous comfort of thus man and force a recognition of something more radically personal, the absolute ownness of one's own life, the fact that it cannot finally be lived by anyone else or for anyone else, and that this ownness is both the deepest burden of human existence and, held rightly, its most honest resource. Not a comfortable recognition, but a settling one, the way cold water is settling, not pleasant exactly, but clarifying, returning one to something actual. Late at night, in the pause between the end of the day's social life and the beginning of sleep, something like this, recognition is available without requiring any particular philosophical preparation. The body knows it. The performance is over. The audience is gone. What remains is simply what has always been there: the breath, the weight of the body against whatever is beneath it, the quality of the dark, the mind releasing its grip on the day's identities and functions and managed impressions, one by one, without ceremony, the competent one, the reliable one, the patient one, the one who knew the right things to say and said them at the right time and held the right expression and kept the right amount of feeling accessible and the right amount contained. These are not dishonest constructions. They are genuinely necessary, the social membrane that makes connection and cooperation and care possible in a world that requires them. There is no reproach in recognizing them as performances. The reproach, if there is one, belongs only to the confusion between the performance and the performer, the forgetting, under the pressure of long habit, that the mask serves the face and not the other way around. They dissolve slowly, these identities, in the particular quiet that begins to gather as sleep approaches, not all at once. The worried one takes a little longer. The one who rehearses the day's conversations, refining what was said toward what should have been said, arguing cases to no one in a room that is emptied, that one takes the longest. But it goes. Eventually. Given enough quiet, given enough patient darkness, given the slow, undeniable accumulation of a body that is tired and a mind that has done what it could and is being called by something older and more persuasive than any argument toward rest. Emerson found this thread of genuine perception in the fields near Concord, in the gap between the approved social self and something quieter and more native than opinion. Nietzsche found it at the workbench of honest self-examination, removing what was borrowed and keeping what genuinely fit. Kierkegaard found it on the silent walk home when the brilliant aesthetic surface was no longer needed and something interior, less adorned and more honest, briefly surfaced. Marcus Aurelius found it at his writing table, by lamplight, setting down the emperor in order to speak plainly to the man. They are all pointing at the same space, not the same answer. The answers differ, sometimes sharply, along lines of temperament and tradition and what each person most urgently needed to understand. But the space they are pointing at is recognizable, the space after the performance, the interior cleared of its managed impressions, the quality of attention that becomes available when there is nothing left to project and no one left to receive it. Kierkegaard's aesthete, walking home through the cold streets of Copenhagen after the party, might have felt this space as threatening as the gap into which the question of what his life was actually for could fall without bottom. That is one way to encounter it, and not an unusual one. The aesthetic life is organized, in part, around not encountering it, around filling the gap with the next performance, the next conversation, the next occasion that requires the brilliant surface and can be counted on to hold the interior silence at bay. The exhaustion this requires is genuine. The skill it demands is real, and the moment on the walk home when the silence arrives anyway, uninvited and patient, is the moment Kierkegaard was most interested in, not because it is catastrophic, but because it is honest, and because what one does with that honesty is the beginning of something different. What one does with it, in the most ordinary version of this experience, in the ordinary end of an ordinary day, not in philosophical crisis, but simply in the tiredness that follows a day of social existence, is rest. Let the silence arrive. Let the identities settle and thin, and eventually, in the long quiet of the night, release their hold. There is nothing being lost in this. The masks will be available in the morning. The professional competence, the parental steadiness, the managed warmth of social interaction, the careful calibration of appropriate feeling, all of it will be there again when the day requires it. The setting down is not a destruction, it is a rest. Marcus Aurelius understood rest as a practice, not simply a physical state. The inner citadel is not entered accidentally, it is returned to deliberately through the kind of attention his private writing modeled, honest, unhurried, expecting nothing from itself except honesty. He was not trying to achieve enlightenment at his writing table. He was not building toward a final transparency in which the imperial mask and the philosophical mask and the personal mask would all dissolve permanently, leaving only pure, undifferentiated consciousness. He was simply resting for a few pages each night in the company of his own actual thoughts, the ones that had not been filtered for public consumption, not arranged for effect, not dressed in the appropriate dignity of an emperor's discourse. There is something in the phrase he used, the inner citadel, that rewards slow attention. A citadel is a fortification. It has walls. It keeps something out. What the inner citadel keeps out, in Marcus Aurelius's account, is not the world or its demands or even its suffering. Those things arrive regardless. What the walls protect is the quality of inner response, the capacity to meet what arrives without being entirely reshaped by it, to remain in contact with something at the center that does not simply become whatever the moment is pressing it to be. Not rigidity, not refusal, a kind of groundedness. The thing that is still there after the day is done and the role is set aside and the performance has run its course, and what remains is what has always remained, waiting quietly through all of it. Nietzsche's artist of oneself works alone. The work is done in the hours when no audience is present, and the product is not a performance, but a disposition, a way of moving through the world that comes from having looked honestly at oneself and chosen, from that honesty, what to carry. This does not mean the artist wears no mask. Masks are necessary. They are the form through which connection happens, through which roles are inhabited, and work is done, and care is expressed in the specific modes that specific situations require. What the artist has that the unconscious mask wearer does not is the knowledge that the mask is a mask, chosen, worn, and available to be set down when the wearing is done. The setting down is what sleep is, in some sense, the most complete and regular and unambiguous setting down available to human beings. For hours at a time, every night, the entire elaborate structure of the social self is released. The professional identity rests. The relational identity rests. The self-concept, the projected image, the managed impression, the carefully maintained boundary between what is shown and what is kept, all of it settles into an undifferentiated quiet that is neither the mask nor the face beneath it, but something prior to both, something that does not need to be anything in particular, something that simply continues, breathing, in the dark. Emerson might have called this the oversoul, the term he used for the deeper stratum of selfhood that underlies all particular identity and role, accessible in moments of genuine solitude and honest perception, the ground from which the trust in one's own experience proceeds. The term is grand, and Emerson knew it and used it anyway, because the thing it was pointing at seemed to him to require a word with some weight, not the social self, not the persona assembled for public presentation, something that was present before either of those and would be present after, the way the land is present before and after the buildings built on it. Sleep reaches this stratum not as a philosophical achievement, not as the result of any particular practice or discipline or examined life, simply as what the body and mind do when the day's labor is complete and the social world has gone quiet and there is, at last, nothing that requires the mask. The breath slows. The muscles that have been holding shape, holding the specific tension of being a particular person in particular company with particular things at stake, begin to release that shape. The chest opens slightly. The jaw, which has been arranged all day in expressions appropriate to various occasions, rests in something more neutral, something that was never visible to anyone because it was never being performed for anyone. This is not the resolution of the philosophical question.